writer, or by a Native American writer, or by some other writer who isn't white. Similarly, if I announce that our next class will be devoted to gender, most students will expect a book written by a woman. But Hemingway was as racial as anyone in his time, and he had gender, surprisingly enough. He had sexuality, too. But we never think to apply such categories to the implicit norm of white, male, heterosexual people. The project of renouncing race as a category of thought, in other words, is complicated by the fact that white culture has for quite some time been engaged in the practice of renouncing and repressing race as a category of thought for many of its writers, to the extent that it is still rare to encounter specialists in Hemingway or other writers who even consider race to be one of their most pressing research concerns. And certainly it is rarer still that such scholars will identify themselves as specialists in white American literature. Aside from those actively engaged in race studies, many literary critics will be satisfied to enter and exit the subject of race with a few quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. and others. And many others will be satisfied, indeed, if the rest of us renounce race and send the message up to the head office. Such approaches, I want to suggest today, rely on dangerously naive concepts of race, superficial conceptions of African American literary history, and simplistic understandings of how scholarship and intellectual commentary function in social space and time. To get at a just approach to this body of literature, we need to learn to look at the race that extends beyond the identity or social positions of authors, the race that is manifest in the social order in which writers lived and worked. So, what are we talking about when we talk about race? That's not an easy question to answer. In The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois famously asserts that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The problem of the 21st century, one might say, is that the problem of the 20th century was even more complex than we imagined, and we have barely begun to understand that complexity. So this is where things get complicated. In my own attempts to understand American racial history, I've come to see race not in terms of groups or individuals or attitudes, but rather as a dynamic system. And I want to suggest today that to understand race, it is useful to attend to the guidance of chaos theory, a theory or a body of theories devoted to the patterns created by complex and seemingly irregular systems. An important turning point in the developing science of chaos, Catherine Hales has observed, occurred when complex systems were conceptualized as systems rich in information rather than poor in order. So chaos is kind of a deceptive term here. What seemed chaotic, this science says, actually has an underlying order that we simply have not apprehended before. And the science has actually proven to be an able descriptor in a wide range of fields, from physical forms to complex social interactions. Chaos theory focuses on, among other things, extreme sensitivity to initial conditions, as, for example, the divergence in the path of two leaves in a running stream. So you set two leaves in a running stream and their paths diverge, and it demonstrates the significant difference of their initial positions in the water's complex currents. The underlying patterns of those paths of development are what Benoit Mandelbrot has identified as the fractal geometry of nature. And as John Briggs puts it, chaos theory tells the story of the wild things that happen to dynamical systems as they evolve over time. Fractal geometry records the images of their movement in space. Fractals, Briggs explains, are images of the way things fold and unfold, feeding back into each other and themselves. Mandelbrot's great achievement was that he gave us a way to see and measure this process. And in his ability to locate the patterns formed by this process, and in his ability to locate the patterns formed by this process virtually everywhere. As James Glick has written, Mandelbrot glided matter-of-factly from pulmonary and vascular trees to real botanical trees, trees that needed to capture sun and resist wind with fractal branches and fractal leaves. So think of branches, think of leaves, or think of blood vessels, and you have a pretty good image of a good part of what fractal geometry is interested in. Mandelbrot and others have extended the application of fractal geometry to account not just for natural forms, but also for the arrangements and technologies of social systems, ranging from economic practices to literary dynamics. Now, I've turned to this theory because I believe that it is important to understand that what we call race involves both the process and the effects of cultures that legally, economically, socially, educationally, and at times even theologically define and distinguish between different groups of people. Cultures group individuals, individuals and collectives respond to such groupings. Those responses often lead to new cultural concepts of and manifestations of racial definition and control, and those new or slightly different cultural dynamics inspire improvisations on established strategies for dominance, resistance, or survival. In other words, a very dynamic and very complicated process. What we commonly call race, in other words, cannot be limited to physical features or mapped by DNA, for it includes the complex processes by which individuals are positioned, both socially and geographically, sometimes delimiting and sometimes extending privileges, options, mobility, and ideological flexibility. And after all these years, we have still barely begun the study of this dynamic process.